When it comes to World War II, aircraft are something which, honestly, the Germans are usually pretty secure on. And when talking about their naval aviation ambitions, their ideas for the Graf Zepplin, their carrier, and their plans for World War II, the fees of the F-167 and JU-87C seem perfectly sensible. They're their potential torpedo bombers. And they are fine aircraft, don't get me wrong. The Germans very rarely produce an absolutely terrible aircraft. But there are problems here. There are problems. Some of them obvious, some of them less so. And one of them really a problem of the Germans' own approach to naval aviation, really. And there are a lot of problems with that. Now, shameless book plug. There is a competition currently going to win, where you can win. There are 2 of these up to be won. They will come with a whole little note in there and all those things, so personalised from me. I think it's a fun composition. I think it's a really interesting one. There's a link down below. But that's not really why you're here. And before I get too far into this video, I think I'm going to say this, because otherwise I'm going to spend my entire time repeating quite a lot of what I did in Key Ship Series 2, Ship 1, the Graf Zepplin. I'm just going to say there should be a link flash up somewhere on the screen, somewhere. I'm not sure where I'm going to put it. I might put it up here, I might put it down there. That will take you there. That includes all the discussions of the Graf Zepplin. All my views on her potential, and her disappointment. And the fact that whilst there are some perfectly interesting and capable systems put in there, especially from their mail ship history, because the Germans have a history of operating mail ships, and they use certain systems from their mail ships in an operation. That's MAIL, before anyone seeks clarification. Those same systems don't necessarily work as a sensible provision for an aircraft carrier. I think one of the problems that Graf Zepplin, broadly speaking, I'm going to point this out, suffers from is that they've got a massive attention to detail, and they want to put in the absolutely engineeringly perfect solution for every single problem, without any views on how those solutions will necessarily interact with each other, without any consideration for how much complexity those solutions add to an already very complex system, because let's be honest, operating an aircraft carrier is not exactly an easy system. It's complex from the get-go. It is complex from the get-go. And I would say also without any consideration for how those systems are going to deal with any potential battle damage. One of the interesting things I'm going to be looking at over the course of the year is the sheer amount of effort put in by various navies into developing systems which slowly harden carriers to damage. Because navies have a lot of experience by this point in the period of history, and in our history, in arming ships which are warships firing guns against the guns of other ships. They have a lot of experience in what to protect, how to protect it, what to provide some form of rafting or some form of shock absorption, what to provide extra thick protection, what to provide physical space between where might be hit and where they are stored or positioned. They have a lot of experience with that. With aircraft carriers, they don't have. The Navy which has the most experience, that's the Royal Navy, mostly thanks to what its seaplane carriers got up to in World War One, is absolutely obsessed with the concept of fuel management systems. That's what causes the Royal Navy to spend quite so much time rebuilding ships which it gets from the Americans. Every time an American built escort carrier turns up in Britain, it goes into a British yard and it gets a new fuel management system put in. Because the British considered the American fuel management system to be a bit of a joke. And the Americans go, it's fine, this is a ship which we're rapidly building. The British go, no, we're putting in our system which drains everything back to the tanks. That's a no-go, and that's an absolute deal breaker for us. And it causes disputes in some ways, because the Americans are going, our system works fine. It's a 90%, it's a 80% solution. Why are you obsessing over the 100% solution? And the Royal Navy just goes, we are. And the Royal Navy's reason for it is because of the damage their ships have suffered during World War One to fire. It's made the Royal Navy absolutely paranoid on it. It's a legacy thing. What's funny though is eventually the Americans, when they actually get a good look at the British fuel management system, and go, "We love that," and copy it themselves, and then it goes full way. But that's what happens between allies. What is really interesting is that a lot of the British fuel management systems are based on they're looking at German ships from World War One. And looking at what the German solutions have been, and they fused the understanding of German fuel management systems with British fuel management systems to produce what they have created. In contrast, things like that on the Graf Zepplin are highly intriguing systems, and they should work, but they do not come with the expression rugged reliability. They come with the expression engineering perfection. And that's a problem. Now, if this is your base material, your base ship for what you're going to be operating from, well, it's aircraft you'd expect to be rather the same. And honestly, the Fieseler F167, that isn't. The 167, you gotta love her, is absolutely not what you would call engineering perfection for this period. The first flight is in 1937. There are 14 produced between 1938 and 1940. These are contemporaries of the Swordfish, of the Albacore, of several other aircraft, but when you consider the developments the Germans have been putting into naval aviation, into aviation as well, this is not what you'd expect. It's a perfectly fine aircraft. It's a perfectly capable aircraft, but it's not going to set the world on fire. It's not going to stand out. It has a top speed of 175 knots, which is 202 miles an hour. Which, yes, it's good. It's better than the Swordfish. But that is kind of like saying I can walk faster than a snail. We all expect to be faster than the Swordfish. The Swordfish was never built for speed. The Swordfish was built for long-range night attacks and reliability and ease of maintenance. Speed was never the criteria. But this is one of the few aircraft which the Blackburn Skua and Blackburn Rock could actually outpace. And they are really not exactly fast for their time. There are other aircraft going around which could also do this. So, okay. What's going on here? Why are they going quite so sensible, quite so basic? Why are they going for this? And look, these aircraft are put into fairly good use. They spend quite a lot of their time serving Croatia. And they are useful for Croatia. There are no examples of this aircraft known to survive, but it's not a bad aircraft. It's just a very low priority and seems to be a low priority even in specifications. And so I thought, first when I was reading into this years ago, I thought, well, okay, They must have been doing a daring second act. That's what it is. This is the insurance model. Well, the daring second act is the Junker JU-87C. And that suddenly became an even bigger problem, really, to look at, because that theoretically started in 1937. They do build some prototypes. They have delays, but one is actually built with folding wings. One isn't. 2 prototypes. One has folding wings, one doesn't. And they are supposed to carry torpedoes, of course. They're supposed to have an arrest. But it was things like the arresting gear was found to be too weak and had to be replaced, and all sorts of tests were being done. And eventually, the C is turned over into the R, which is nothing to do with maritime work. Really doesn't have anything to do with maritime work. And everyone carries on. Everyone just carries on. The R is the long-range version of the JU-87. It's an improved version. That's great. But the C never really gets off the ground. Never really gets to be fully tested. Now, again, this could be the fact that the Kriegsmarine's carrier program stalls, so no one really pushes it forward. But here is the problem. Here is the basic problem of all of this. If you want to have a carrier come into service, and if you consider their original timeline, they've not war starting in 1939, but the timeline for the carrier supposedly coming into service, all these things, you needed aircraft in production and an air wing ready to go before the carriers enter service to test the carrier. You need to have the aircraft firmed up, and again, yes, you can go, well, there's the Fiesler. But that's 14 models built between 1938 and 1940. That's not exactly a high pace of production. And if you consider with carrier operations, especially your first carrier operations, unless you absolutely believe your own hubris, you should be building enough to deal with a significant number of accidents, let's say, write-offs of aircraft. You need to be training air crew. You need to be doing all sorts of things. This all really, really does suggest a very low priority, very low level of seriousness in these efforts. And again, this was confusing me. But I can answer the problem. I can answer the issue with all these, and this is not going to be the longest key ships or key aircraft. I might actually reach my original deadline of nearly roughly 20 minutes videos. But I can offer an idea as to why this is all going on. And let's talk about the German aerial torpedoes, because the reason I'm focusing in on torpedo bombers is torpedo bombers are what have actually sunk ships in World War I. They're the known quantity. They're the proven capability. Yes, you might have a bomber and it might work. But you don't know that for sure. Under wartime conditions, what has actually sunk a ship? A torpedo bomber. And what are the 2 ways of sinking a ship? Putting in a hole in it, which lets in an ungodly amount of water, so it sinks, or starting a fire which can't be controlled, and burns the ship out, and burns the crew out of the ship. Those are the 2 ways of sinking a ship. Fire or large hole which lets in water. Holes which let in air don't sink ships. They're annoying, you have to repair them, but they don't sink the ship. Holes which let in water sink ships, especially if the ship can't control it. And this is where I started to be really surprised when I first looked into this many years ago now. Because I had, prior to that, only really studied German torpedo and aerial torpedo development in World War I. And they'd done really well in that period. I mean, they came up with this. They had all sorts of ideas going in World War One, which were really quite cool. If you want to look up the Siemens torpedo glider, please do. It's a really interesting concept and design, and frankly, it's something which, if they continued on, could have been very, very scary. And it does give you a bit of an idea of people going, well, you know, drone warfare, all these things, they're really new concepts. Remote controlled aircraft carrying a torpedo, World War One. It's controlled by a. They had various methodologies of working out how they can control it and power it and support it, but they had ideas. It's an interesting system. Yet by World War II, 1939, the Germans were building less than 5 aerial torpedoes a month. And in testing, about half of those failed. It wouldn't be until pretty much 1942 when Adolf Hitler throws an absolute hissy fit that things actually start to change that much. And there is a bit of improvement in 1941. Until that point, they are reliant upon a torpedo which is an adaptation, I will say this, of a Norwegian design, which is atrocious, so that's the one they're producing domestically. And the other torpedo is not even the best aerial torpedo the Italians have that they're importing. So here's the problem. How do you get serious about torpedo bombers if you don't have aerial torpedoes? When I look at the figures of how many torpedoes Germany is building versus how many torpedoes they actually need to use in wartime, it gets really absurd. The fact is that until really late 1944, the Germans are always at a deficit of aerial torpedoes. They never have enough. The most reliable system, as far as anyone understood it in 1939, the system which everyone else was investing in, they were also investing in the bombers and dive bombers and looking in their capabilities and thinking about using them and wanting to use them, but they were all investing in the torpedoes because it was the insurance system. And there is nothing going on there. There is nothing which is truly being pushed forward and developed. And before people start coming to me, well, you know, there are better versions of the F5. They are. They have the F5 and the F5A. Neither are produced in great numbers. The F5B starts to come into service in 1941, and that is a much bigger improvement on the F5. The F5W, well, it's definitely not the finest of Italian products. As I've said before, the Italians can produce Ferrari. They can also produce... Well, I'm not going to be quite that rude, but we all know that the Italians, let's be honest, the Alfa Romeos, lovely to look at. There's never been an Alfa Romeo which hasn't had an issue. There is not a single friend I know who has an Alfa Romeo who has ever turned around to me and said, everything is working as it's supposed to be at this time. Everything. There is always something not working. This is not the finest product even the Italians produce. This is not even Ferrari level, not even Alfa Romeo level. This is the F5W, as the Germans called it. As the Italians called it, well, they had all sorts of different names. But let's put it this way. Its dropping speed's 150 knots from roughly 200 to 600 feet up. It had a range of 16,400 yards. And its speed started when it hit the water at roughly 13.5 knots, and by the time it reached the end of its run, it was 3.9 down to 3.9 knots. So it could be dodged by most freighters. But leave that to one side, because that's if it ever comes near anything. It's a weapon system which is described as primitive by some historians, rudimentary by others, by me in a draft of a book which is nowhere near publication yet. I've described it as a bargain basement entry level design which hadn't paid no attention to the scenarios it was actually going to be used in. And, well, it completely lacked any depth control, which is kind of important for an aerial torpedo, as they tend to hit the water, and, well, gravity can do what gravity does. Lateral control was, well, the phrase up here is already rudimentary, but lateral control was interesting. And, yes, I do mean that in the full British sense of whenever we describe something as, that is highly interesting. Its runs often resulted in the torpedoes doing unintentional spirals, curves, going nowhere near their target. And by the way, the Germans get about 1,000 of these. They have about 10,000 torpedoes throughout the course of the war. About. This is according to some of the books I've read. Others actually have lower figures than that. So roughly 10% of their torpedoes, and the vast majority of their torpedoes in their early years, are this. Because they're just not building them themselves. And at that point, when you're looking at the quality of the torpedoes, you've got the F5, which has to be dropped at a speed of less than 75 knots, from no more than 50 or 80 foot high. And it does do 2,200 yards, but that's does it at 33 knots, so it's actually a decent thing. You sit there and look at it and go, well, one's long running but incredibly slow, and by the phrase of slow I mean most vessels can outpace it. And it's only doing the 13.5 knots for a very short period of time. I'm not saying it's a linear curve down to 3.9 knots. It's more like that. Down to 3.9 knots. So it drops off quite dramatically down to 3.9 knots. Yeah. Am I doing the right way? Yeah. Starts off 13.5, ends at 3.9. And it drops off quite dramatically. Yeah, it's got a range of 16,400 yards. But by the time it gets there, there are going to be people overtaking it walking. At a brisk pace. So the Germans suffer. We get into this a lot, and I try and explain this a lot in the various videos when I'm talking about them, because people see the Germans' stats on their equipment and think, they're great. But if you ever want a demonstration of why their naval aviation is in a real trouble in 1939, and why it never really comes to fruition, just look at the fact that they've got a carrier, which they are building and working on. They've then got torpedo bombers, which they are half-heartedly working on. And the torpedoes, they're doing nothing on. And yes, they still have problems with their submarine torpedoes and various things due to lack of testing, but at least they have them. And if you consider how their torpedoes developed later in the war, they get some really good torpedoes later in the war. But if you honestly had fielded, let's say, the Graf Zepplin in 1940 had actually sailed into, pardon Norway campaign. Well, think about it. What aircraft is she probably launching from? Probably torpedo bomb-wise, it's going to be the Fieseler, F-167s. Okay. What torpedoes have been dropping? Well, they have a couple of F5s probably around, but let's be honest, they're not producing more than 5 a month, and only half of those work. So the odds are they're using F5Ws. So you've got an aircraft, which is not exactly the fastest aircraft, and it's going to be risking its life to drop a torpedo, which has a good chance of either going so deep it's never going to hit the target, or going off on its own random route. Yeah, is that worth the investment? Is that worth the risk of life? It doesn't strike me as being so. It really doesn't. It really isn't. It's a scenario you're looking at and going, no. No, it's the classic case with Nazi Germany. They rush into war far too soon for their infrastructure industry to catch up. If I don't know, if Plan Z had actually been allowed to come to fruition, that would have given them time, another few years, to fix these problems, to get their own aerial torpedoes themselves. All those things. That would have probably produced a far different mix. But in this scenario, you've got a very complicated carrier design that is over-engineered. You've got aircraft designs coming through which show their lack of focus because of their lack of over-engineering. They are almost too simple. That's actually a good thing, though, because it means the F-167 is going to work. You have no doubt the 167 is going to work. It is going to be reliable as anything. It is going to work. I have no qualms with that aircraft. I'm basically looking at going, you would be a solid workhorse. And it was, when it was available. It was a solid workhorse. There weren't many built, though, so it was very rarely available. But leave that to one side. But the torpedo systems? Why am I risking any of those aircraft? Why am I risking any of those aircrew to try and use those torpedoes? I'm not. Okay, so now I have the Fieseler as a very slow bomber? Or a reconnaissance aircraft? No. So there, she stops making sense. The JU-87C makes even less sense, really, when you're thinking about that. Using it as a dive bomber, okay, fine. You're combining dive bomber and torpedo bomber, and probably it's going to be using dive bomber role. Okay, that's fine. The trouble with the JU-87 is we all know that any fighters nearby, it's going to be in trouble. And, well, the whole point of layered fleet air defense is there should be fighters nearby, and if the Germans are actually launching a carrier, the British won't have paused their carriers. That's one of the few things. Well, for Churchill to justify the carrier and capital ship pause, he has to make sure that the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau aren't described as fast battleships in Royal Navy reports. Which, again, is another dereliction of duty, but we'll leave that to one side. He's actually very, very good. He just firmly believes he made the right decisions in World War I, and that wasn't really the case for World War II. It was a different scenario. But this is it. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about a lack of depth and the problems behind the curtain in the German defence industry around World War II. And the fact they achieve as much as they do is a testimony both to the innovations they do actually produce, and also a testimony to the fact that the Allies were woefully underprepared psychologically for war, especially the French. When it comes to radio, as a nation state, they were woefully underprepared for it. And, well, at this point, I was going to talk about the year of the aircraft carrier war coming up, because next week, of course, we have the conception, operation, conclusion of the Ben Maishri, which is a vessel which does give some of the reasons for why the Royal Navy is quite so obsessed with fuel management systems. But actually, I think it's worthwhile focusing on the Yangai mission. Because here's another little secret of World War II that you don't hear enough about. The Yangai missions are critical for the Germans getting decent aerial torpedoes. They are working on some good designs themselves, they really are. But there is a lot of help received when the Japanese deliver the Type 91. And it becomes the Lufen Torpedo LT-850. That is a lot of help for the Germans. You would not really think so, because you'd think, surely they do it themselves. But the Japanese delivered 70 torpedoes. None were used operationally, as far as we know. But they were also delivered with all sorts of stats, including the Japanese pneumatic controller for roll stabilization system. And the Germans examined this heavily. They were really looking at this and going, oh, this is some good ideas. This is some really good ideas. They'd also got some better Italian torpedoes during the war, but yeah, they had some bad experiences. They had some really bad experiences. But it's an interesting thing to consider in the terms of this torpedo development for the delivery from the Japanese to the Germans, because the traditional myth is always German technology going to the Japanese. On this occasion, it was much needed Japanese technology coming to the Germans. The trouble is, it came a bit late. If the Germans had been able to acquire Japanese aerial torpedoes and designs in 1939, 1938, preferably 1937, if they had built the relationship and been able to do that in that period, the Germans would have been a lot more capable, a lot more scary a threat in Norway and various other scenarios for the British to deal with. Again, especially at the beginning of the war, where bombs are lighter. One of the things that's often problems that happens with World War II is that as the bombs get heavier throughout the war and the aircraft get better and better at dropping them and targeting ships, when those bombs do hit, those are bigger, more damaging, better explosives, etc., better detonators, all these things worked up. We see that damage and we go, oh wow, aircraft are scary. In 1939, 1940, no, it's still very much the torpedo is the primary killing weapon of killing ships with aircraft. The bombs might do the damage, the torpedoes definitely will, and allow you to kill bigger targets with those aircraft. If this Yangai mission, if similar to that had happened, if a Japanese merchant ship had dropped off Type 91s in 1937, it would have been a very, very different World War II. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and, well, I could of course make that last scenario the question, but what I would like to actually make the question is, if you're the German Navy and you're serious about naval aviation, when you start the construction of the Graf Zepplin, when you start the construction of it, in 1936, what do you do? What do you do? Because, as I've said, from my perspective looking at it, they spend a lot of time debating over very finite and minute details over the carrier, to the extent that she ends up being a hodgepodge of ideas and all sorts of things put in, casemated 6-inch guns and all sorts of things, which frankly... And the guns get doubled because no one wants to say, no, we made a mistake. Design, you were supposed to have only 8, but, for some reason we've stuck in double mounts on those casemates rather than singles. It's a case of there's a lot of inertia with the carrier. How do you make it so that the air group is ready for a carrier and justifies completing the carrier? Because again, I think this is another thing which feeds into the carrier not being completed. Let's be honest, what are you arming that carrier with? In 1939, she's launched in December 1938. If I wanted her finished off in 1939, what am I going to put aboard her that is actually a viable striking capability? Dive bombers? Well, yeah. But her air group originally was supposed to be 12 JU-87 dive bombers, 10 Bf-109 fighters, and 20 Fieser 167 torpedo bombers. Because the torpedo is the reliable weapon system. They never build more than 14 Fiesers. It's just absurd. But the fact is, the primary strike weapon is supposed to be the torpedo bomber. Torpedo's not available. How do you fix that? What would you do if you were in that scenario? In 1936, you're laying down the Graf Zepplin and you're put in charge of making sure you have the aviation side ready to go. How do you do it? What do you do? Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and no, I didn't manage to keep this to 20 minutes. But it's not that far over half an hour, is it? It's not that far.